I've known David since we were teenagers. For nearly 30 years, he has been my closest friend. We've witnessed each other through the heartaches of high school, disastrous job interviews, marriages that bloomed and faded, and the gradual yet inevitable shifting of life's priorities. So when she invited me to her family's lake house for the weekend, it seemed like nothing extraordinary, just two old friends reconnecting. What I didn't expect, what I never could have anticipated, was the way her brother Mark would look at me that evening. It had been years since I last saw him. Back in our youth, he was the charming younger brother, always with a mischievous grin and a cocky attitude. He was the one who played pranks, snatched cookies from the tray, and flirted with anyone who crossed his path. Mark was 5 years younger than us, and at the time, that felt like a vast divide. We were women. He was still a boy. But time, as it does, has a way of bridging such gaps in the most surprising of ways. I arrived late that Friday evening. The sun had already kissed the treetops goodbye, casting long golden shadows over the dock. The lake shimmered in a copper glow, still and serene. David ran out to greet me, arms wide, laughing. As always, we embraced each other tightly, as if no time had passed. She led me inside where the scent of pine wood and nostalgia flooded my senses. It had been over a decade since I'd been here, but everything felt comfortingly familiar. The cozy, faded throw blankets, the photographs of summer barbecues and childhood swims, that same creaky screen door. And then I saw him. Mark was in the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine. He turned when he heard us, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Yes, he had aged, but gracefully. His once jet-black curls were streaked with salt and pepper, and his piercing hazel eyes had softened, though they remained intense. His face held that quiet, weathered kind of dignity you see in old westerns, a life lived with earnest purpose. "Elaine," he said, his voice a little deeper than I remembered. I smiled, adjusting my overnight bag on my shoulder. "In the flesh," I replied. He chuckled, walked over, and gave me a brief but warm hug. That's when I felt it. Not just the embrace itself, but the lingering of his arms, a beat longer than I'd expected. There was something subtle, something intentional in that moment. Later that evening, we sat on the back deck, the three of us, watching the stars peek through the velvet sky. David had gone inside to fetch dessert, leaving Mark and me alone. The sound of crickets hummed softly in the background. "I always thought you were too cool for me," Mark said suddenly, without looking at me. I turned to him, surprised. "You were just a kid," I replied. "You were more interested in your skateboard than in having conversations." He smirked. "Maybe. But I still noticed you had this quiet strength. I used to watch how you always stood up for David when she fought with our parents. You were fearless." I fell silent for a moment, letting his words sink in. "Funny," I said finally. "I always thought you never noticed me at all." He turned to face me then, and in that instant, beneath the soft hum of the summer night, with the twinkle of stars reflecting in the lake, I saw it. The look. It wasn't overt. It wasn't aggressive. It was open, vulnerable, as though he was seeing me not as I had been, but as I was now. That look stirred something in me I hadn't felt in a long time. It's strange, isn't it? How someone can disappear from your thoughts for years, only for them to return and stir your world like a stone dropped into still water. We didn't speak much after that. David returned, full of laughter and stories, and the moment passed. But throughout the evening, I kept catching Mark's gaze, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but curious. It was as if he was rediscovering something he hadn't expected to find. The next day, we all took a walk by the water. The air was fresh, tinged with the scent of pine and lakeweed. David went ahead to take a phone call, leaving Mark and me trailing behind. "Do you still wear that necklace?" he asked, pointing to the small silver charm resting against my collarbone. I looked down and smiled. "Yeah, it was a gift from my late husband. I never take it off." His eyes softened. "I remember when you got it. You were 16. You came over for dinner and couldn't stop smiling. Those were good years." I nodded. "Yes, those were good years." He looked at me with a quiet understanding. Maybe that's the most honest thing anyone can do, to accept who they are now, even when it's different from who they once were. We stopped walking. The breeze stirred the branches overhead, and a bird flitted through the trees, as though in agreement with his words. I looked at him, and in that moment, I saw something soft, something rooted in his gaze. He wasn't the reckless boy I had once known, but a man who had lived, who had weathered his own storms, who had known the weight of love and loss in his own way. And just then, something in the air seemed to shift. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers brushed my cheek, and my breath caught, not because I was startled, but because I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had touched me like that, like I mattered, like I was truly seen. I didn't move. Neither did he. The moment stretched between us, thick with unspoken emotions. And just as quickly as it had arrived, he stepped back, clearing his throat. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet. I didn't mean to overstep, but he hadn't. Not at all. I nodded, unable to find the words to express what was swirling inside me. That night I sat alone in my guest room, staring at the moonlit lake through the window. My thoughts were a storm, quiet but forceful. Memories, feelings, and questions I hadn't dared to ask myself in years. Something was happening, something I hadn't expected, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. But for the first time in a long time, I was curious enough to find out. The morning sun filtered gently through the thin curtains of the guest room, casting a soft golden glow across the wooden floor. I lay in bed longer than usual, listening to the distant sound of birds and the soft creak of the house settling around me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the usual urgency to rush through the start of my day. There was something about that lake house, something that made time feel slower, more deliberate. Maybe it was the stillness of the water, or the comfort of being with people who knew my history. Or maybe it was the way Mark had looked at me again. At breakfast, the three of us gathered around the old farmhouse table. David was cheerful, chattering away, sharing funny stories from work. But I couldn't help but notice how Mark's gaze kept drifting toward me. It wasn't intrusive. It wasn't demanding. It was quiet, thoughtful, as though he was trying to understand something about me, or about us. And I'll admit, I was doing the same. When David left to run an errand, offering for me to come along, I declined, saying I needed some time by the water. Truthfully, I needed space to think. So I wandered down to the dock, a book in hand, though I hardly opened it. The gentle lap of water against the wood, the distant call of a loon, it all lulled me into a peaceful, reflective calm. A while later, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Mark. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low. I smiled. "Of course not." He sat beside me, just far enough to keep things comfortable, but close enough that I could feel his presence. We sat in silence for a while. Silence that didn't feel awkward, but rather companionable. Then he spoke. "I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable yesterday," he said quietly. I looked at him. "You didn't." He let out a breath, as if he had been holding it in. "Good, because I meant it." And somehow that made my heart beat a little faster. "Mean what?" I asked, though I already knew. That touch, that look. It wasn't just nostalgia. It wasn't about the past. He turned to face me, his eyes reflecting the shimmering lake. "It's about now, about seeing you as you are. Strong, beautiful, kind, and real." I wasn't used to hearing words like that. Not since my husband had passed. Not since I had quietly closed myself off from the possibility of being seen that way again. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "I just needed you to know." The air between us felt charged, not with lust or expectation, but with a quiet intensity, a raw honesty. It was the kind of moment that could slip away, if not acknowledged. So I reached out slowly and rested my hand over his. His thumb gently brushed my skin. We stayed like that, just holding each other's touch as the lake shimmered in the late morning sun. "I haven't felt this way in a long time," I admitted, my voice shaky would true. "Neither have I," he said. And then we just sat together. No need to fill the silence. Later that evening after dinner, David was upstairs reading Mark, and I found ourselves alone in the den. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "I'm sorry about your husband," Mark said softly. "I know it's been a few years, but grief doesn't have an expiration date." "No," I said, surprised by the warmth rising in my chest. "It doesn't. Some days are fine. Others, it just sneaks up on me." He nodded. "I lost someone too a few years back. We weren't married, but we were serious. Cancer, quick and cruel." I looked at him real. He looked beneath the rugged exterior. He carried his own quiet grief, different from mine, but parallel in its weight. And maybe that's what connected us in that moment. Not just attraction, not just nostalgia, but two people who had both lost something and were beginning to wonder if it was possible to feel again. I stood up, walking toward the window. Outside, the moon hung low, casting silver streaks across the watermark. I said, still facing the glass, "What are we doing?" He came to stand beside me. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I don't want to pretend I don't feel it. Whatever it is, it's real." I turned to him, and our eyes met. There was no pressure, no rush, just a question lingering between us. He leaned in slowly, so slowly. I could have stepped away if I'd wanted to, but I didn't. When his lips touched mine, it wasn't fireworks or thunderclaps. It was warm, gentle, exploratory. A kiss that asked, "Are you ready?" rather than, "I want you now." And as I kissed him back, I realized something deep in my chest. I was ready, ready to feel again, ready to open that locked door in my heart, if only just a little. When we pulled away, we couldn't say much. There wasn't a need. The moment had spoken for itself that night. As I lay in bed, I didn't feel guilt or fear, just possibility. The kind I hadn't dared believe in for a very long time. I woke up before sunrise the next morning, not out of restlessness, but because I wanted to see the lake at dawn. There's something about that time of day, the soft blue haze before light fully touches the earth, the stillness that feels like the world is holding its breath. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stepped quietly onto the back deck. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. Mist rolled off the lake's surface like a secret, being whispered into the sky, and then I heard the door creak behind me. Mark. He didn't say anything right away, just joined me, handing over a warm mug of coffee, which I took with a quiet nod. His presence felt easy now, like he belonged there beside me, sharing the silence. I couldn't sleep. He said, "Me neither." We stood together, the blanket around my shoulders, brushing his arm. Every time the breeze shifted, there was something sacred about that moment. No grand declarations, no rushing forward, just two people slowly stepping out of their separate shadows. He turned toward me after a long stretch of quiet. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you." I looked at him, searching his face for any trace of insincerity. There was none. "I know this is complicated," I said softly. "David, she doesn't know, and I don't even know what this is yet. I'm not asking for answers." He replied, "I just want to be honest with you." I swallowed hard, the warmth of the coffee grounding me. "We've both been through too much to play games." I said, "So let me be honest too. This feels real and terrifying. But also kind." That word lingered between us, kind. It wasn't about thrill or infatuation. It was about finding something gentle in a world that hadn't been so gentle for a long time. That morning we didn't kiss, we didn't touch, we simply were, and that in itself felt more intimate than anything physical. But of course, the quiet couldn't last forever. David returned around noon from town. She burst through the door with the same energy. She always had arms full of fresh fruit and weekend gossip. She didn't notice the subtle shift between Mark and me. Not yet, but I was aware of every glance, every pause, every stolen smile. Later that afternoon, the three of us went kayaking. The sun was bright, glittering on the water, and David was laughing as she tried to steer with her usual lack of coordination. Mark and I stayed a little behind our paddles, barely disturbing the mirrored surface of the lake. "I've missed this," David called out ahead. All of us beamed together. Mark looked at me. "Me too," he said, But the way he said it wasn't about nostalgia, it was about now. That evening after dinner, David went to bed early, claiming a headache. I offered to help clean up, and Mark stayed behind it, drying dishes beside me in the warm glow of the kitchen. Our hands brushed once and then again. "I think we need to talk," I whispered. He nodded, drying his hands on a dish towel, then leaning back against the counter. "I care about her. She's my best friend." I said if she knew something was happening between us, it would change everything. Mark nodded slowly. "I get that, but let me ask you something." I looked up. "If we didn't do anything, if we kept pretending there was nothing here, would it hurt any less? Would it make it not real?" I bit my lip. "No, it wouldn't." He stepped forward close enough that I could feel the heat from his body, but still keeping just enough distance to let me decide what came next. "We don't have to rush this," he said. "I don't want to hide it, but I also don't want to do anything that would hurt you or her." I nodded. "Maybe we just take it one moment at a time." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made you feel safe. That night, I didn't sleep in my guest room, but I didn't sleep in his either. We ended up back out on the deck, a blanket between us watching the stars. Our shoulders touched, and our hands found each other beneath the fabric. There was no urgency, no pressure, just comfort, warmth, a deepening trust that didn't need to be named to be understood. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I rested my head on his shoulder and closed my eyes. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," I murmured. "Nifa, do I?" You replied. "But for tonight, I'm right here." The next morning arrived wrapped in gold. I woke up on the deck, the blanket still pulled over us, my head resting against Mark's shoulder. The lake was glassy and pale, the world hushed, as if holding its breath for what came next. I didn't move at first. I didn't want to. There was a comfort in the quiet rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his arm around my back, and the soft stir of the trees above us. For the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to go wrong. I felt present. Eventually we sat up. He stretched and smiled at me, that soft morning smile. People only share before the world demands their attention. I could get used to this. He said. I didn't reply. Just reached for his hand, but reality, as it always does, him knocking. Soon enough, David found us on the deck an hour later. She stepped out carrying us, hearing 2 mugs of coffee already, halfway through a story about a ridiculous squirrel that had made its way into the pantry. And then she paused. Her eyes flicked from me to mark our proximity, the way our fingers slowly slid apart, but not fast enough to be unnoticed. She didn't say anything, not then. She simply handed me the mug and sat down beside us, quiet. We didn't speak about it all morning, though. I felt the shift like a tremor under my skin. By afternoon, I couldn't avoid it anymore. I found David on the back porch, sitting alone, legs curled up beneath her. Her gaze was focused on the trees, but I knew her thoughts were elsewhere. "Can I sit?" I asked. She nodded. I lowered myself beside her, the tension between us crackling like distant thunder. "I should have told you," I began, "about me and Mark. I didn't mean to hide it. I wasn't sure what it was yet. I still don't know what it is." She didn't speak for a long time, just sipped her tea and stared out into the forest. "He's my brother," she finally said, "and you're my best friend. It's a strange thing to imagine you together." "I know," I said quietly. "Believe me, I didn't expect it either." But she continued, turning to me. "I also know what you've been through. I know how lonely the nights have been for you. I've seen it in your eyes. Even when you smile." I blinked back tears. "And if someone," she added, her voice breaking just slightly, if someone is giving you a reason to feel alive again, I would never stand in the way of that." I reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. "Thank you," I whispered. But she said with a small smirk, "I'm going to need a little time to get used to the idea." I laughed, a short, surprised sound that felt like release. Fair enough. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not awkward, but companionable, like we had broken through something deeper and come out the other side, more honest with one another. That evening, Mark and I took one last walk along the lake. Before I left, the sun was setting, spilling warm amber light across the water. The path was quiet, only the crunch of pine needles beneath our feet and the occasional call of a distant bird. "I'm not expecting a fairy tale," I said softly. "I'm not offering one," he replied with a smile. "Just something real, something worth exploring." I turned to him, taking his hand. "I want that too." He leaned in and kissed my forehead. Not a passionate kiss, not dramatic, but tender, loving. When it was time to say goodbye, there were no promises, no dramatic scenes, just a long hug that lingered with all the meaning. Neither of us needed to say out loud. As I drove away from the lake house, the sky darkened behind me, and the road stretched quiet and open ahead. And I thought about everything that had happened, about what it means to love. Again, not with youthful abandon, but with the wisdom of someone who has already known loss. I thought about Mark's quiet strength, the way his presence felt like a steady current instead of a crashing wave. And I thought about myself, about how much I had closed off, and how maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to open back up again, not for someone else, but for me.